Howdy folks, Dave here at Thunder Mesa Studio, where this week we're getting started on a real honest-to-goodness Wild West Boomtown.
With Calico Mountain itself a little over halfway done, it seemed like a good time to make some real progress on the town of Calico too. Until recently, this area has been little more than some foam blocks and cardboard mock-ups, but now it's time to build it into a real Wild West Boomtown of the 1880s.
Well, the first question to answer is, what kind of town do we want it to be? Generally speaking, western towns came in a few different varieties. You had your railroad towns, agricultural towns, logging towns, and my personal favorite, mining towns. I like mining towns because of the way they're kind of haphazardly laid out with whatever land was available. Not a real planned community, if you know what I mean. Unlike railroad towns and agricultural towns, which are usually laid out on a grid. Now, my town of Calico is kind of a hybrid version between the Knott's Berry Farm ghost town and the real town of Calico up in the mountains of San Bernardino. Now, if you go up to Calico, the real one, you'll see that it's laid out all over the hills in kind of a haphazard fashion with buildings at different levels and the street going up, and that's what I've tried to replicate here. Now, the first thing I want to do to lay a good groundwork for the town is build the main road right up through the middle here, and that'll pretty much define where all the structures are going to go.
As for the structures themselves, I'll be drawing a lot of inspiration from the designs of Paul von Kleiben, the fantastically talented artist behind so many of the iconic structures at Knott's Berry Farm ghost town. I first discovered von Kleiben's work in Chris Merritt's wonderful book on Knott's Berry Farm history, Knott's Preserved, and I have been a huge fan of his watercolor sketches ever since. Now, I'm building a boomtown rather than a ghost town, so my structures won't be nearly as run down as the Knott's versions, but I do hope to capture a lot of the same charm and character.
And speaking of groundwork, I also wanted to show you the 12-volt wiring system that I have for the lights on the layout. It starts with a little 12-volt brick transformer like this, and each section of the layout has one. Wires come from this to a power strip, which is hidden underneath the benchwork, and then wires come down, feeder wires come down from all the structures and plug into that. And that has allowed me to power the 3mm LED lighting in what is the only finished structure in town so far, the Birdcage Theater, which was built for the layout by my friend Jake Johnson. I'll be using Sculptamold to model the road, and I like to mix it up in little dishes like this, little flat containers. That's about 2 cups and just enough water to make a thick paste. I'm also doing something a little bit different this time. I'm going to mix in some of the scenery base color to tint the Sculptamold to make it match the scenery that's already there. So this is just my regular Scenic base. Take a little bit of that, dump it right in there, and mix it all together with my fingers like making mud pies. Just realized one thing I forgot over here. Towels. Oops. Well, I've removed 90% of the structure mock-ups, and I'm going to start right down here at the grade crossing and just work my way up to the top of the hill. Let's trowel it on here. This is a good old palette knife I like to use for this kind of thing. What I want to do is create kind of a crown in the middle of the road and then have it taper off down towards the sides.
After the Sculptamold was applied with palette knife and fingers, I used a soft 1-inch brush dipped in water to smooth the surface. I also found that applying a little more pressure with the brush was an excellent way to add the ruts created by wagon traffic.
Now while I wait for my Sculptamold dirt road to dry, I'm going to go ahead and fill in some of the last holes in the scenery. Block all this in with some pink extruded polystyrene foam. Just gonna measure and cut some pieces to fit with my hot wire tool.
I used a Woodland Scenic's hot wire tool to shape the 2-inch thick XPF foam and Loctite Power Grab construction adhesive to glue it into place. With the cliff face fully blocked in, I mixed up another batch of Sculptamold to add a textured surface to the rock faces. For a more complete description of this technique, you can check out my video on building the rockwork for Calico Mountain in part 7 of that series. With the sculpting done, I left everything to dry overnight before starting on the final scenic painting.
Well, I've let this dry overnight, and unfortunately it's not completely dry yet. In some spots I can even still move the Sculptamold around. That's kind of unusual. Usually here in Arizona at least, this stuff dries rock hard overnight. My theory is adding latex paint to the mix has slowed the drying time down considerably, slowed the working time down, which can be good or bad. If you want more working time, that's a good thing. If you want to hurry up and get the painting done, like I do, it takes a little longer. But, so now my question is, my dilemma, do I wait for this to dry, or do I just go ahead and finish the painting? Well, I'm going to go ahead and finish the painting. It's not a best practice. It's not something I recommend. You should wait for it to dry completely, but I've done a lot of scenes like this, so I'm pretty confident that I can go back and paint it without messing up the sculpting underneath. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish the scenic painting now, and the first step is going to be getting a full coat of the scenic base color on here, because as you can see it is dried, because of the Sculptamold, has dried a shade or two lighter than the actual color should be. If you've watched my other scenery videos, you probably know that the next step is a dark wash on these rock faces. So I'm going to protect the track here with some masking tape, because I'll be using this diluted black acrylic paint in a spray bottle to apply that. Well, now we're at what I call the ugly phase of the scenery, because, well, let's face it, it looks like a mess. But if you've seen my other scenery videos, you know that I start with a light scenic base and a dark scenic base. Well, I've mixed the two of those together to make a medium color, and this is actually the color that most of the scenery will be. Halfway between the dark and the light. I mix them 50-50. So now I'm going to go through and kind of dry brush this on. Now I know that I just said dry brush, but that's not really what I'm doing here. The brush is not completely dry, but I am just trying to hit the tops of the surfaces here so that the shadows mostly show through. This is not hard to do, by the way. It's actually hard to get the paint down into those nooks and crannies, so if you just go right lightly over the top, the brush does half of the work for you. Now, while that's all still pretty wet, I'm going to take some of my dark scenery base, which is basically raw sienna, go back and hit some areas to add a little variation. Great for making streaks coming down like that. And blend it right in, right on the scenery. Now I want to take some acrylic burnt umber and some burnt sienna and do exactly the same thing. See how I'm kind of feathering this into the paint underneath because it's still wet. And I just use the burnt umber in places where water would likely run off and stain the rocks. The burnt sienna, just to add some iron oxide, give it that mineralized look, but a little goes a long way. And then go back one more time with the light scenic base and start on the highlights. And this you do want to kind of dry brush. Remember, it's just paint. If it gets too heavy, you can always paint over it. And the last thing is, I want to add some true highlights. For that, I like to use an acrylic color called unbleached titanium. Just hit the tops, kind of dry brush it on. If it gets too strong, you can mix it with a little bit of your scenic base, tone it down a little bit. But remember, acrylic colors always dry a shade darker than they go on. Now the last thing today, I'm going to go back and touch up this masonite fascia where I've made such a mess of things.
I also decided to go back in with some black and dark brown ground chalks to simulate the desert varnish which is so often seen on sandstone cliffs like this.
Well, I can see by the sun slowly setting in the west that that's all the time we've got for this week, amigos. Thanks for coming along for the ride. I hope you join me next time in this series where we finish up this road with some sanded grout and start building some retaining walls and foundations for all of these western buildings. Until then, keep moving forward. Adios for now. What? If I could sashay like John Wayne, I wouldn't need to talk about it.